why you wouldn't survive a single night in a medieval castle. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The stone walls of the castle, thick and imposing, seemed to absorb the last rays of light, turning a dark gray. You, an innocent modern guest, had just crossed the drawbridge and, after a long journey, felt the weariness of the day. Your adventure in a medieval castle seemed to be just beginning, but the reality was far less glamorous than the movies made it out to be. The first thing you would notice was the smell, an overwhelming and persistent mixture of wood smoke, sweat, animals, mold, and yes, sewage odors. Castles, no matter how grand, did not have sanitation systems as we know them. Toilets were in fact small rooms with a hole in the floor that led to a cesspit, or more often, a moat at the base of the castle. The air inside was heavy and stale, difficult to ignore. As you were guided to your room, you would observe the uneven stone floor. There was no carpet, and any attempt to walk silently would be frustrated by the sound of your footsteps and the echo that the architecture created. The walls, also of stone, were cold to the touch, and the dampness seemed to permeate everything. There were no light switches, and the only illumination came from a few flickering torches and candles, casting dancing, spooky shadows on the walls. The smell of wax and burning animal fat was added to the mixture of aromas of the place. In your room, the bed seemed like a point of refuge. However, it was different from what you were used to. The wooden frame, often carved, was high to avoid the cold drafts that crept along the floor. The mattress was a fabric bag, usually of linen, filled with straw or feathers, which shifted with every movement. The sound of dry straw rustling each time you moved would be the first sound to lull you to sleep. And the fleas, the fleas. No matter how clean a castle could be, insects were a constant presence. The beds, made of natural and warm materials, were a paradise for them. The itching would begin subtly, but would soon become an irritation impossible to ignore. Security was a continuous concern. The windows, small and often without glass, had only a wooden shutter to protect from the wind and rain. This, and the absence of locks as we know them, would leave the door only propped by a simple latch, creating a feeling of vulnerability. And the cold. The lack of central heating meant that the warmth of a fireplace in the great hall did not reach your room. The temperature would drop as the night progressed, and you would huddle under the few heavy woolen blankets, which were barely enough for the penetrating cold. The silence was not interrupted by cars or planes, but by organic sounds, the wind howling in the chimney, the distant sound of an animal from the stable, perhaps the creaking of a door in the great hall. Any of these sounds could be scary in the total darkness, without the familiarity of the modern world. And so, as you toss and turn on your straw bed, with your skin itching and the cold seeping into your bones, the reality of the medieval castle sets in. The adventure has turned into a struggle against discomfort and uncertainty. You close your eyes, but sleep seems distant, a promise that the body, accustomed to modern comfort, cannot fulfill. The night was just beginning. Why you wouldn't survive a single night in a medieval castle. The darkness of the night deepened, and you, lying on your straw bed, felt increasingly restless. The attempt to sleep had been thwarted by the cold and the itching, and there was also the sound. The castle, which during the day seemed like a silent stone monument, now echoed with an orchestra of unknown and unsettling noises. Rats, an ever-present feature in any medieval structure, began their nocturnal activity. You could hear them scratching at the walls, scurrying in the spaces between the stones and perhaps even in the roof eaves. The sounds were constant, small whispers and squeaks that, in the stillness of the night, seemed amplified. With each noise, your body tensed, the fear that one of them might climb onto the bed, mixing with the already present discomfort. The wind, now blowing harder, found its way through the cracks of the windows and doors. It howled, a long and ghostly wail that spread through the empty corridors. Each gust brought with it the smell of dampness and earth from outside, reminding you that you were isolated, surrounded by a moat and impenetrable walls. And the safety? The door to your room, secured only with a simple latch, felt like an illusory protection. The idea that someone could easily open the door, or that an intruder might have hidden in the castle, was a source of anxiety. You tried to rationalize, reminding yourself that castles were fortresses designed for defense, but the lack of control over your surroundings, the total darkness, and the absence of any form of communication with the outside world were overwhelming. There was no phone to call the front desk, no light to turn on and dispel the shadows. Your bladder, which does not stop working just because you are in the Middle Ages, began to signal its needs. The thought of having to get up and venture into the darkness to use the latrine was terrifying. There were no night lights, and you would have to feel your way, relying only on your hands to guide you through the uneven stairs and corridors. The vision of ghosts or hauntings, fueled by childhood stories, mixed with the reality of the sounds and shadows, turning the simple need to use the toilet into an epic and frightening journey. And the latrine itself, with its hole in the floor, would be an unpleasant experience, with the smell and the risk of falling into the moat being a very real concern. Time seemed to pass slowly. You lie on your back, counting your heartbeats, listening to every sound in the castle. The creak of a distant floorboard, the sound of a horse in the stable, the sound of something you cannot identify. Your mind, accustomed to the tranquility of modern life, enters a state of alert. Your senses, sharpened by the perceived threat, try to identify every noise, every shadow. Your body tenses and your muscles ache. Insomnia sets in, and you realize that the night will be long and uncomfortable. The dampness and cold persisted, and with each hour the temperature seemed to drop a little more. The heavy woolen blankets were the only barrier between you and the biting cold, but they were heavy and rough, irritating your skin, already sensitive from insect bites. You turn over, trying to find a comfortable position, but the straw mattress, hard and uneven, does not cooperate. The darkness was total. There was no light from a street, a neighbor, or a full moon. The only light came from a small crack in the window, revealing the dark outline of the clouds passing across the sky. And this total darkness, this absence of light, was oppressive. It erased the notion of space and time, leaving you in a limbo of uncertainty. Sleep, that luxury of modern life, seemed impossible. Your mind, overloaded with sensory stimuli and anxiety, could not relax. The itching, the cold, the smell, and the sounds combined in an assault on your senses, making any attempt at rest a futility. And so, lying there, with your eyes wide open, you get lost in the soundscape of the castle. Every sound is a mystery, every shadow a threat. The night, far from being a period of rest, is a constant struggle against discomfort and fear. The castle, which during the day seemed like a symbol of strength and grandeur, has revealed itself to be a hostile place, where your survival for a single night seemed to be an insurmountable challenge.
The clock, a modern concept, was absent. All you had was the deepening of the darkness and the slow, agonizing crawl of time. The sounds you had noticed earlier began to shift. The scurrying of the rats seemed to lessen, perhaps because their nocturnal foraging had moved to another part of the castle. But other sounds now took their place. From somewhere below, you could hear the soft, muffled stomping of a guard on his rounds. The sound was not a heavy boot on a wooden floor, but a quieter, more deliberate tread on uneven stone. The guards, in their woolen tunics and simple leather shoes, moved with a practiced rhythm. They were not there to comfort you, but to watch for threats from the outside. Their presence, while a sign of a sort of security, also served as a constant reminder that danger, real or perceived, was always a factor. You would hear their footsteps approach your door, pause for a moment, and then slowly fade away into the echoing labyrinth of the corridors. Your nose, now accustomed to the initial onslaught of odors, began to pick up on new ones. The smell of the dying embers in the hearths, a faint, acrid smoke that lingered in the air, the faint metallic scent of the chainmail and weapons stored in the nearby armory, and a particular musty smell that was a combination of old tapestries, damp stone, and centuries of unwashed humanity. It was the smell of the castle itself, a deep, pervasive odor that clung to everything and was impossible to escape. Your body, stiff from lying on the uncomfortable straw mattress, protested with small, persistent aches. Your neck was crooked, your back felt a constant dull pressure from the hard surface, and your legs, tangled in the rough woolen blankets, felt numb. Turning over was a major operation, a clumsy rustle of straw and heavy fabric that would awaken you even more. You'd try to find a new position, hoping for relief, only to discover that every position was equally uncomfortable. The promised refuge of sleep seemed further away than ever. The small, insignificant details of your predicament began to take on immense importance. The lack of a pillow, a soft and forgiving place to rest your head, the scratchiness of the wool blankets against your skin, the single, tiny opening of the window that offered no view, only a narrow sliver of the black sky and the occasional glimpse of a star. You started to notice the feel of the cold air on your face, a subtle draft that found its way through a crack in the wall, a constant, annoying reminder of the low temperature. You thought about the water you had been given before you retired. It was likely cold and unfiltered, possibly drawn from a well that was shared with animals and susceptible to whatever ran off the castle walls. The thought of drinking it now, in the middle of the night, was unappealing. You were thirsty, but the thought of the taste and the unknown purity of the water was enough to keep you from trying to reach for it in the total darkness. The silence of the castle, when it did fall, was not peaceful. It was a heavy, oppressive quiet, a vacuum of sound that made the ringing in your ears seem loud. This silence was punctuated only by the occasional grunt of a sleeping guard or the faraway whinny of a horse in its stable. The absence of noise was as unsettling as the presence of it. It made you feel isolated, alone, in a massive stone structure, a small and vulnerable creature in a world that was indifferent to your comfort. And so you lay there, a modern mind trapped in a medieval body, enduring the sensory and physical assault of the castle. The hope of a good night's sleep was a distant memory. Instead, the night had become an exercise in endurance. You were not fighting dragons or defending against invaders. You were simply trying to survive the night, hour by long, uncomfortable hour. The feeling of helplessness and a profound sense of isolation were the only certainties as the night crept slowly toward a dawn that seemed impossibly far away.
The night had reached its coldest point. It was that pre-dawn hour when the darkness felt most absolute and the temperature dropped to its lowest. You could feel the cold not just on your skin, but deep within your bones. It was a penetrating, unyielding cold that the heavy woolen blankets could no longer fully protect you from.
You could almost see your breath in the still air of the room, a faint, wispy cloud that appeared and vanished with each breath. The stone walls, which had absorbed the day's warmth, were now radiating a profound cold, turning the entire room into a sort of stone refrigerator. The sounds of the night had once again changed. The occasional footsteps of the guards had become more regular. This was the changing of the guard, a new shift of men taking over the long, arduous watch. You could hear the muffled conversations, the quiet clinking of mail, and the soft, deliberate tread of new boots on the cold stone. It was a different rhythm than before, a sign that the night was progressing, but not yet over. The matter of personal hygiene, which you had been trying to ignore, was now a persistent thought. The concept of a modern toilet, with its clean water and efficient flushing, felt like an impossible luxury. You had been given a simple wooden chamber pot. Its presence in the corner of the room was a constant, low-level source of discomfort. The idea of using it and then having to endure its presence for the rest of the night was unappealing. You were a modern person, accustomed to cleanliness and privacy, and the crude reality of medieval hygiene was a source of profound, quiet revulsion. The lack of any way to wash or freshen up added to the feeling of being trapped in a less than ideal environment. The journey to the castle had been long and dusty, and now, lying here, you felt every bit of that grime. Your skin felt clammy and a bit sticky, and a faint film of sweat from the initial discomfort of the bed had now dried, leaving a strange, itchy residue. The fleas were still there, but it was now part of a larger, more general feeling of being dirty and unkempt. Your mind, now completely untethered by sleep, began to wander in a disorganized, fatigued way. You started to focus on tiny, inconsequential details. The way a small crack in the wall looked like a map of a tiny, forgotten country. The way the rough threads of the blanket felt against your thumb. A texture that was both coarse and surprisingly intricate. You'd count the faint sounds you could hear, trying to categorize them. A drip of water from somewhere high up. The rustle of a mouse that was somehow quieter than before. A distant single clang that you couldn't identify. The sheer loneliness was an unexpected pressure. Surrounded by a massive castle and its inhabitants, you were profoundly alone. There was no one to talk to, no way to signal for help, no friendly voice to remind you that you were safe. The feeling was not one of being abandoned, but of being a single, insignificant point of consciousness within a vast and indifferent structure. The stone cold, the rough fabrics, the oppressive darkness, they were all reminders that this world was not built for your comfort, and that you were entirely on your own. You considered trying to get up and walk around, but the thought of navigating the cold, dark corridors with their uneven stone floors and hidden steps was too daunting. A simple misstep could lead to a sprained ankle or a nasty fall. It was safer, if not more comfortable, to remain in the confines of your bed. The choice was not between comfort and discomfort, but between one type of misery and another. And so you lay there, a modern guest in an ancient fortress, waiting. The cold seeped into your bones. The sounds of the castle, in their slow and steady progression, were a constant, unwanted companion. Your mind, tired and disoriented, was lost in a fog of small details and profound loneliness. The night, which had begun with a sense of adventure, had now become a quiet, physical, and psychological struggle for survival. You had not been attacked or confronted by an enemy. Your enemy was the environment itself, and it was winning.
The night was drawing to its close, though it was still a considerable distance from what we would consider a reasonable waking hour. The total darkness had begun to soften, a subtle and almost imperceptible shift from absolute black to a very, very deep gray. This was not the light of dawn, but the faintest hint of morning light, filtering through the tiny unglazed windows and the narrow slits in the castle walls. It was a miserable, unwelcoming light that did little to dispel the shadows, but instead made them more solid and imposing. The cold was at its peak. The air was a sharp, biting presence that stung your nostrils with every breath. You could feel a faint crust of moisture on the inside of the stone walls, a thin film of ice forming where the dampness had finally surrendered to the cold. The blankets, which had been your only defense, now felt heavy and inadequate. You were cold to the very core, a deep, pervasive chill that had seeped past your clothes and into your bones. Your feet in particular felt like blocks of ice, and no amount of wiggling your toes could bring feeling back to them. The sounds of the castle once again had transformed. The scratching of the rats and the patrolling of the guards had ceased. They had been replaced by the quiet, purposeful stirrings of the castle's domestic life. You could hear the faint, muffled sounds of a fire being lit in a distant kitchen, the soft scrape of a flint and the crackle of kindling. Soon after, the dull thud of a heavy axe on wood and the rhythmic clatter of pots and pans. This wasn't the sound of an alarm clock. It was a slow, deliberate announcement that the long, cold process of starting the day was underway. The smell, too, had changed. The oppressive mixture of smoke and mold was now tinged with the faint, comforting aroma of wood smoke and something else, the smell of bread being prepared, a hint of yeast and flour that signaled the beginnings of breakfast. However, this small bit of familiarity was not enough to make the situation feel safe or comfortable. Instead, the smell made the reality of your predicament even more vivid. You were a guest in this harsh environment, and your very survival was dependent on the slow, meticulous, and entirely unmodern process of the day beginning. Your body, battered and bruised by the night's endurance, ached in every joint. The fatigue was a heavy blanket, thicker and more oppressive than the woolen one you were under. Your mind, no longer wandering, was now simply numb, a dull throb behind your eyes. The idea of getting up and facing the day was almost unthinkable. You had not slept at all. The entire night had been a torturous, uncomfortable vigil. The bed, once a symbol of rest, was now a monument to your misery. The straw had shifted and compressed, leaving you with a series of hard, unyielding lumps that dug into your back and hips. The itching from the fleas had become a constant low-level irritation, a physical manifestation of your complete lack of control over your surroundings. As the light continued to grow, a pale gray peeking through the gaps in the stone, you realized that you had not survived the night in any meaningful sense of the word. You had endured it, yes, but you were broken, exhausted, and profoundly miserable. You were not a heroic knight or a cunning spy. You were simply a modern person, accustomed to comfort and cleanliness, who had been stripped of every modern convenience and left to suffer the simple, grinding reality of medieval life. The night had not killed you with a sword or an arrow, but it had defeated you. It had broken your spirit and your body, and you realized that you wouldn't have lasted another night, let alone a month or a year. The quiet, persistent, and mundane realities of the medieval castle were far more deadly than any imagined enemy. You had survived the hours of darkness, but you had lost the battle for rest, comfort, and sanity. The
The sun would rise soon, but you were already defeated.
The gray light had finally conquered the darkness. It was not a grand or glorious victory, but a slow, creeping, and thoroughly miserable one. The faint glow now filtering through the window revealed the full, unsparing truth of the room. The air, which had seemed empty in the darkness, was now thick with dust motes dancing in the meager light. The stone walls, once a source of comfort, appeared stained with dampness and streaked with soot from torches past. The floor, uneven and cold, was littered with bits of straw that had escaped your mattress. Everything looked a dull, lifeless gray. Your body, however, was the most telling testament to the night's events. The moment you tried to move, every joint protested with a loud, cracking stiffness. Your back ached in a way you never knew it could, a deep, persistent soreness that made straightening up a slow and agonizing process. Your muscles, tense from hours of sleepless discomfort, were now tight and knotted. The itching from the fleas had not subsided. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking your skin, a constant reminder of your unwanted cohabitants. The call to morning was not a gentle one. The clanging of a bell, loud and jarring, echoed throughout the castle, a signal for everyone to rise. This was not a lazy weekend morning. It was the abrupt start of a long, arduous day. You could hear the muffled sounds of people stirring, the scraping of feet, and the murmur of distant voices. This noise, far from being a relief, felt like a rude awakening from the quiet misery you had become accustomed to. The next challenge presented itself in the form of the chamber pot. It sat in the corner, a stark and unpleasant reality. Its contents needed to be emptied, and you knew this task would neither be clean nor private. The idea of carrying it down a long, cold corridor, likely to a communal waste area or a designated chute, was a level of degradation you were wholly unprepared for. The lack of running water meant that even a simple hand wash was a luxury. You would have to make do with a basin of cold, possibly murky water, which did little to remove the grime and the feeling of being fundamentally unclean. Breakfast, when you finally made your way to the Great Hall, was another disappointment. The hall was smoky and noisy, filled with the loud chatter of servants and the smell of wet wool and damp bodies. The morning meal was not a plate of eggs and toast, but a simple fare of coarse bread, possibly a piece of hard cheese, and a bowl of thin, lukewarm gruel. The food was bland, and the texture of the bread was tough. It was sustenance, nothing more, designed to give you just enough energy for a day of hard labor. The drink was likely watered-down ale or mead, since the water was often unsafe to drink. It had a strange bitter taste that you were not used to. As you sat there, eating your simple meal, you looked at the other people around you. They were all tired, their faces showing the marks of a lifetime of hard work and discomfort. They were used to this life. They had survived countless nights like the one you had just endured. But they weren't thriving. They were simply living. Their bodies and minds conditioned to a level of hardship that would be unthinkable in your world. The night had not killed you with a dramatic act of violence, but it had broken you in 100 small, mundane ways. It had taught you that survival was not about strength, but about endurance. You were a modern person, accustomed to comfort, safety, and hygiene, and the medieval castle had stripped you of all of it. You had survived the hours of darkness, but you had lost the battle for rest, for comfort, and for the very concept of a good night's sleep. The sun was now fully in the sky, but you were already defeated.